Hi, my name's Nick Barker, and this talk is about the concept of difficulty in video games. What makes games hard, what makes them easy, and how we can combine together different types of challenges to create rewarding experiences for players. So just for some background, video games are actually kind of getting on in age as an art form. Pong, which is the first kind of recognizable video game, was released almost 50 years ago in November 1972. And since then, video game design has evolved immeasurably, right? We have these crazy realistic 3D graphics, immersive, novel-like storylines, huge online multiplayer, and there's so many other things that have changed. But an interesting thing that I've been thinking about recently is how, on average, I would say that games these days are quite a lot easier than the average game that you would have seen around the era of Pong in the 70s or 80s. Difficulty used to be a major hallmark of games. They were really hard by today's standards. And I think it's interesting to look at why games have become easier over time by looking at why they were so hard in the first place, right? So games in the 70s and 80s were designed around a very different business model that we have today, right? Instead of having home consoles or home computers that you would play games on, most people would play video games in arcades, right? On arcade machines. And the design of arcade machines and the financial model was very influential in how the actual games themselves were designed. So pretty much all arcade machines had a similar kind of revenue generating mechanism, right? Which is that you insert a coin or multiple coins to start the game. You are given a limited number of some type of resource, lives, health, something that can run out, right? And the game starts easy and the difficulty progressively increases as time goes on until it becomes almost impossible. And when you lose all of that resource, your lives or your health or whatever, you see a game over screen. And if you don't insert more coins in a short amount of time, 10 or 20 seconds, then you get a permanent game over and you have to start again from the beginning, right? So it's a very strong incentive to get people to put more coins in the machine. And you can see from this perspective, difficulty is very important, right? Because if the game's too easy and if you can insert just like 25 cents and beat the whole game start to finish, not only are you probably not going to play the machine again, but you're going to be on it for a long time, not putting in more coins, where other people could be using the machine, putting in more coins, right? So difficulty was actually a major financial decision in the design of these early games. And, there were some other incentives to play, people found the challenge interesting on its own. You had your score kind of like accruing over playing the game. And then at the end, you had these high scoreboards on the machines that were publicly visible that you could save your name to and, show your friends, oh, I've got the high score on this Pac-Man machine at the local arcade. But I think the side effects of the difficulty appeared as a result of the culture around the games, not so much as the driving, fundamental reason, which was a financial decision, right? And of course, the strategy, this monetization model was so pervasive throughout the industry that we now have an entire genre of games that we refer to as arcade games, even though they're not actually played on arcade machines anymore, right? And so it's fascinating how that financial driver actually created a genre that adhered to some specific characteristics. And games were difficult by design on these arcade machines. But the interesting thing is, through creative innovation, they were actually different in they were actually difficult in different ways, right? They didn't all use the same mechanisms of difficulty. And that to me is like a fascinating aspect of game design that I think about a lot. So the second half of this talk is about different ways to create difficulty in video games. And I'm going to go through 10 of the kind of big categories that I see when I look at games. They might be different to things that you think about, but I'll go through each of those and how you can work those challenges into your games. So the first and most obvious one is mechanical skill. This type of challenge is the first thing that pops into people's heads when you tell them that a game is hard. When you're like, oh, I played this game the other day and it was really difficult. They think of difficulty in terms of mechanical skill. So this is the type of difficulty that you get when you're playing sport or when you're playing a musical instrument, right? It's about speed and coordination and physical skill, right? And Most first-person shooters very heavily rely on mechanical skill, fighting games, for example. And the idea from an abstract perspective is you just gate the progression or the victory of a player based on their level of success at a difficult mechanical task. And those mechanical tasks can be broken up into kind of three major categories, which can of course be combined together in any way that you want. So the first one is timing, right? And that's when the player needs to perform a predictable action at a certain time, right? So we're talking about something that the player can see coming from far away. They need to hit a baseball in a sport game and they can see the ball coming, right? They can predict that they need to hit an action, but then the window to get it correct is small. Reaction speed, conversely, is where the player needs to perform an unpredictable action at a certain time. So you might be waiting and watching, a doorway, expecting that an enemy will come through at some point, but you don't know when it is, right? And so you have to react to an unpredictable scenario. You can't see it coming and hit the timing. And the third one is precision, right? And generally, precision is just about controlling a value to a target that's quite small, right? So often precision relies on a continuous input method, like a mouse or joystick. That's opposed to a discrete input method like a button, which is just on or off. Whereas a mouse, you actually have to control the mouse, move the cursor to right onto an enemy that's very far away. That's precision. So you probably already have an idea about how you would create these challenges, some ideas about these things. Timing specifically, remote bombs are like a classic game design mechanic that we use to create a bit of difficulty and flavor in games. You watch your enemy walking towards bombs that you've planted and you have to wait until they walk right onto them to press the button, and that's timing because you can see them coming, right? Reaction speed, blocking an attack in a fighting game is not only reaction speed because you don't know when the opponent's going to attack, but often because there are different types of blocks as well. You might have to wait until you can see just the edge of the attack that the opponent's going to do, and then you have to do a mid block or a low block specifically, right? You don't know what kind of action you have to do until you see the scenario. And precision, it's very, very common. You probably have designed precision into almost every kind of game that you've worked on before. You have to aim the cursor onto something specific within a certain amount of time or something like that. All shooting games rely on precision very heavily. So the second type of difficulty is reduced error tolerance, right? And this is simply limiting the number of mistakes that a player can make before they get a major punishment, like returning back to a checkpoint or getting game over, right? So platform games, platformers relied very heavily on reduced error tolerance. And modern combat-oriented games like Dark Souls are notorious for how little error tolerance they have. You make one mistake in a long fight and you just die in one hit. So we often combine this with mechanical difficulty to test a player's ability to perform several mechanically difficult actions consecutively without making a mistake, right? That's how you can combine them together. So in terms of creating these challenges, what reduced error tolerance is fundamentally about is that you want to provide some resource in your game that depletes when the player makes a mistake, right? So you have lives or health, or you could have ammo, for example. Imagine you have a single arrow in a game that you have to shoot and hit some big enemy in the eye, and if you miss, you lose, right? You have one shot to make it. So limiting resources, right? But also important to think about is a lot of these challenges, you can actually flip them from a punishment to a reward if a player is able to interact with the mechanism really well, rather than failing to interact with the mechanism, right? And what I mean by that is maybe what you could do is actually reward a player for making fewer mistakes rather than punishing them for making mistakes, right? You increase the damage every time they hit a nicely timed attack for a big combo. That can be much more satisfying than punishing people for making a small mistake, right? And another cool little design trick you can use is you can vary the amount of error tolerance depending on, for example, the story or the lore in your game. So some bosses can kill you in one hit, whereas normal monsters do less damage. Like a varying error tolerance is a wonderful way to create challenge and difficulty in your games. The third one is probability. So this basically adds difficulty to games by forcing players to weigh odds, to take calculated risks, or, for example, to retry multiple events until they manage to succeed. Some examples, critical hit mechanics in RPGs like Pokemon, Final Fantasy, and you can have probability-based item drops in ARPGs like Path of Exile or Diablo, that type of stuff. Probability is loosely grouped into kind of like these two big classifications, which is trivial and non-trivial. So a trivial probability event probably occurs multiple times. They have a relatively benign outcome. And examples like missing an attack in a battle, right? You can use this to add a bit of flavor to your game, make it feel not so repetitive. Whereas a non-trivial probability event actually alters the outcome or the course of a game like permanently, right? And some good examples of this is like dialogue options in Disco Elysium or the Fallout series, that type of stuff. Often you have one shot to do the dialogue to convince the NPC to do something, otherwise they refuse to talk to you ever again. In terms of creating these challenges, it's reasonably easy, right? Take any action in your game that the player can perform and make it not have a 100% chance of succeeding. That's essentially how you design it, right? It's really important, again, like reduced error tolerance, to think about the psychology of positive outcomes versus negative outcomes, right? Players really, really hate when they lose at a chance event that does something negative for them, right? If they have a lot of chance events to get little bonuses, they don't really care if they lose on a chance event that gives them a bonus. They're like, oh, well, I missed that one. Maybe I'll get the next one. But if they have a negative effect where they take damage when they lose on a chance event, it can be very, very frustrating. So just be aware of that. Some design things to think about: can player choices like items or stats or abilities affect the probability, right? Can you design a build in your RPG to make it more likely that you'll succeed at certain types of probability events? Another thing to mention is if you're using non-trivial probability events that alter the outcome of the whole game, often, how do you avoid this phenomenon called save scumming, where you incentivize a player to try and save the game right before they attempt the probability event so they can reload and just try the same thing over and over? Do you want to prevent that? Good things to think about. And of course, it's really important to mention with probability, be extremely careful when you use these mechanics in your game because they're very, very addictive. They hit some psychological bug, in our brains that makes us vulnerable to gambling. And it's very important that you're careful with how you use these mechanics because we want to design ethical games that encourage healthy play, not addiction. The fourth mechanism of difficulty is obscurity. So this is where you create difficulty by hiding things from the player's immediate view. Items, power-ups, objectives, new areas, that type of thing. Very, very common in open world RPGs and closed world RPGs like Zelda, Skyrim, Fallout series, Bethesda games, platformers like Hollow Knight, this type of stuff. Obscurity is used a lot in RPGs, and especially in games where players have freedom of choice to move around, right? Essentially, this is based on the idea that a player can choose to go one of multiple directions, and you hide different things in the different choices that the player can make. So in terms of creating these types of challenges, one underrated tip that I have is that we tend to focus very much on the visual as game designers, right? But there are other senses that we can use to interact with games. So try hiding your secret from sight, but revealing it to sound, revealing it to touch. If you're using a console that has haptic, vibration, or a phone or something like that, reveal those to the other senses. So a player walks across a tile on the ground, they get a strong vibration, and that's where they need to dig, for example. You can create the implication of there being a secret, right? This is a big trick in obscurity challenges, like have a long tunnel filled with monsters getting harder and harder and harder, and then finally at the end you have an empty room, right? There's such a strong implication there that there's something hidden in that empty room. And that's how you can create this type of challenge and interest, make the player search around for something hidden in that room. You can use records of progress or indicators that there are areas or things left unexplored, right? So you can have, say, a map in your game that might have fog on different unexplored areas, or like a long hallway that seems to go to nowhere. So you can imply, oh, maybe if you go explore this area, you'll find something secret. And, records of progress, like say you have some collectible item in your game and you can find 100 of them and the player's only found like 80, they're incentivized to feel like, oh, there's 20 of them hidden somewhere. And that creates an interesting challenge. And a very common strategy people use as well is just providing very little direction or indication of where you're supposed to go next. Allow the player to kind of discover the points of interest in the world themselves without any indication of like, here's a point on the map that you have to walk to. The fifth form of difficulty is memorization. So essentially, you just require players to remember facts, arbitrary combinations of things, names, vulnerabilities, locations of items, locations of areas, that type of thing. Very heavily used in fighting games. Fighting games are all about memorization, knowing all the moves of your character, all the moves of the character the opponent has chosen, memorizing the combos, that type of thing. Puzzle games often rely on memorization, and RPGs like Zelda actually have very heavy memorization elements as well. So in terms of how we create these type of challenges, so many games have combos in them. Combos are a very, very common mechanism of creating challenging interest. And one of the reasons is it's usually mechanical difficulty combined with memorization. You remember the steps of the combo, and if you execute them correctly, you're rewarded. So that's a positive feedback, right? A very nice little game design trick that they discovered in Zelda early on. The reason I want to highlight this is because it's a great kind of off the beaten path use of memorization. What happens is that as you progress through the game, you find areas that are inaccessible, right? Because you don't have the correct item to be able to access whatever it is. You might find, say, a cave where you can see a chest, but it's blocked by a wall of ice, for example. And you assume, oh, okay, I need some kind of item that can melt this ice, right? But you don't actually get the item until much later in the game. So they incentivize this memorization. Okay, oh, where was that cave in the world? I have to go back and find where it was. They incentivize that, and that's a mechanism for creating challenge because they reward you for remembering areas that were previously inaccessible. And of course, another thing that you might not have thought of with memorization is that a lot of modern games have an incredibly huge horizontal variation in the content that they present to you that you have to remember in order to play effectively. For example, in League of Legends, there's like 140 something different champions, different characters, and across those, there's like 878 abilities, right? And if you don't know what all of those abilities do, you're probably going to get wrecked by one of them at some point because you weren't expecting something to happen. And so having that memorization improves your chances of winning. It's a challenge, it's difficulty. The sixth type is time investment, right? And I've combined two kind of major categories here that are not necessarily so similar to each other, but I think they fall under a nice heading. So this is essentially either forcing the player to perform a repetitive task or waiting for some real life time to elapse. And essentially what it comes down to is you're just creating difficulty by drawing out the amount of days that a player has to engage with your game in order to progress or hit some victory condition, right? So MMOs, World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy, absolutely typical for them to use time investment mechanics. We have all these mobile games that use energy, and games like Animal Crossing, for example, use time investment very heavily. So there's kind of two categories of time investment. Grinding is like this mechanic where you force a player to perform a repetitive task over and over in order to progress, rather than doing different things or solving challenges only once. And time gating is where you actually prevent the player from progressing until some real world amount of time has passed, right? So instead of just like creating a building in a game, you wait an entire day. You have to come back tomorrow, right? So in terms of creating these challenges, using the real world clock is a surefire way to create time investment challenge, like blocking the player from doing something until the next day. Mobile games use this very heavily, but in a kind of unethical way where they'll say, oh, this unit will take until tomorrow to build, but you can pay money right now to have it unlock immediately. Those type of microtransactions are very pervasive in the mobile game world. You can vary the amount of experience that it takes in your game to level up such that players are actually forced to figure out their own way to gather that experience. You don't just hand it to them as a result of playing through the predetermined challenges that you create. And what a lot of this boils down to is you simply take existing mechanics and you just multiply the number requirements. Right? So if you're building a game, if you're building a building in a game like StarCraft and it takes 30 seconds, what would the game be like if it took 30 minutes instead? Very, very different game. Becomes a long-term strategy game instead of a short-term one, right? You take the amount of experience, maybe it takes 10 monsters to level up and you instead multiply that to 1,000. It's now a very different game, right? So that's how you kind of create time investment, difficulty, and challenge. The seventh one is strategy. So this is essentially a mechanic by which decisions have consequences, right? Actions have a flow-on effect later in the game. It's not like you finish the level and then nothing you did in that level counts towards the next level, right? Strategy is about flow-on consequences. And the two major things that are being used here are thinking ahead and limiting resources, right? Thinking ahead is where you have to predict what the outcome of your choice is, because if you make the decision, it's going to have consequences later. And limiting resources is essentially where you limit the amount of actions that a player is able to do in a certain amount of time, right? Or you limit the amount of resources that they can use before they have to simply wait and stop doing things, right? So all games tend to have some kind of resource limitation, but strategy takes it to the extreme and actually makes the careful usage of resources like a core part of the challenge. So one of the interesting things about strategy is that turn-based games are automatically strategic, right? Because they limit the amount of actions that you can do. They limit the amount of time that you can actually apply to making changes to the world, right? In a fighting game, you can kind of apply as many actions as you're actually able to, as fast as your brain's able to work. And often people just like try and make as many attacks as they can. But a turn-based fighting game where you can only make one punch or one kick and then the opponent gets one punch or one kick suddenly becomes a very different game. It becomes very strategic, right? You can create resource feedback loops. This is a very important thing in strategy games where say you spend some money now in order to create a building that generates more money over time. So in 10 turns from now, you'll be much richer despite the fact that this turn you're poorer, right? That's a very important thing to create strategy. And it's worth mentioning that if you don't want strategy in your game or you want strategy in your game, the most important thing to think about is, do actions have consequences? How can we add more consequences to more actions if we want more strategy? How can we take away consequences, long-term consequences from actions if we don't want strategy? The eighth one is logic. So this is essentially creating difficulty by requiring players to understand rules, understanding how rules apply to a scenario, right? And then potentially reverse engineering how to go from one state to another while abiding by the rules. And so pretty much all puzzle games use logic, right? Puzzles are pretty much about logic. But you also have meta, something that's referred to as meta in complex RPGs, which is where people think very carefully about how to create a build, for example, that produces the most damage or the best survivability in the long term. So in terms of creating these challenges, you might not have thought about this before, but most logical challenges in games are kind of about discovering the correct sequence of events, right? You have to do certain things in a certain order, and the logic is about understanding how the rules will force you to do things in a certain order, right? If you want to design these types of puzzles, like, I actually built a puzzle game just recently, and I had a lot of questions from people saying, oh, some of these puzzles are so hard and complicated. Like, it took me like 30 minutes to figure out what the solution was. How do you possibly design these, right? Because they assume that you have to be even better at solving the puzzles to design them. And that's actually not true. The biggest trick that you can use is working backwards from the final state to where the player actually starts, right? So if I take, for example, a dungeon in a Zelda game, a dungeon in an RPG that uses puzzle elements, you start from the boss room, you put a locked door on the boss room, and you take the key and you move the key way over the other side of the dungeon, right? Then over the other side of the dungeon, you put a locked door on that room and move that key somewhere else. You just work backwards. And then once you've decided on the correct path, once you've actually figured out what the correct path is through the dungeon, then you work forwards and you add all of this, all of these tricks, right? You say, oh, it looks like you're supposed to go here, but go somewhere else instead. That's a great trick for creating logic puzzles from scratch. And if you want to create puzzles, one of the important fundamental thing is you need some set of rules, right? As I explained before in this scenario with a dungeon, you need some kind of mechanism like keys unlock doors, right? That's a rule that forces players to act in a certain way. And it's the interactions of interlocking sets of rules that create really interesting logic puzzles. Number 9 is something I refer to as learning curve. And this is kind of a little bit more murky and abstract as a type of difficulty, but it's essentially creating the expectation that the player is going to fail at first. And an expectation that they're going to play the game many times, they're going to practice, right, to improve their ability to play the game, to improve their understanding of the game. And this is very different from time investment, right? Because time investment as a difficulty mechanic kind of gives you strength and gives you new things by default, right? When you grind in an RPG, it doesn't matter if, by the time you get to level 60 in an RPG, for example, it doesn't matter if as a player, you're just as bad at the game as you were at level 1, right? Because your character is much stronger. The same abilities do significantly more damage. That's not the case with learning curve. So the learning curve difficulty is where you're relying completely on the player becoming more skillful at a task that they're trying and practicing over and over again. It's like playing a musical instrument, right? So some examples for this are like roguelike games. So Hades, for example, you get stronger and you can unlock abilities, but the main thing that you're actually doing is becoming better at playing the game yourself. City builders are a similar kind of thing. You build a city, you have a huge fire and everything burns down, or you end up with a giant traffic jam and your economy collapses. So you restart, you learn, and you play again. You're on the learning curve. So in terms of how we actually create these challenges as game designers, first big thing is you can just not allow saving or checkpoints, right? So if the player makes a mistake or they lose, they don't just get to keep going, right? They have to practice the part of the game that they lost at over and over until they can beat it reliably, right? Whereas if you have a game that's based on like levels, for example, there might be a certain type of challenge that a player finds really hard and they play it a bunch of times, but then after they beat it, you beat the level and you don't have to play the level again, right? It's an important distinction with learning curve. You need to force players to learn how to do the core mechanics of the game better. And in general, in these games, you need to have very satisfying mechanics, because it's much harder in a game with the learning curve to rely on the story to generate interest, right? Because your interaction with the story is actually gated on how well you learn to do this repetitive task, right? You generally don't get to see more of the story until you actually get better at the game, right? So it's hard to rely on the story. You need to have really ironclad mechanics. And the last one, the last type of difficulty is just multiplayer. If you add multiplayer to your game, it's hard instantly, right? It just adds difficulty by default. And there are two major categories of multiplayer games. The first one is PvP, which is player versus player. You're fighting against other players, you're competing against other players. It creates competitive difficulty, and it's worth mentioning that it's quite hard to control, right? If you have a small pool of very good players who are absolutely dominating the large pool of worse players, you end up with a lot of people having a bad time, right? The second type is player versus environment, PvE. And this is where you have players on a team who are coordinating to try and solve some kind of challenge provided by the game itself. And this creates a different type of difficulty in coordination and team management, right? But it's easier to control as a game designer because you can just tweak how difficult the actual encounters are, right? So that's it in terms of how the different types of difficulty, and I think it's worth mentioning that it's a really good idea to try and mix and match different types of difficulty, right? And how they're applied, right? Don't always apply difficulty the same way, apply different types of challenge. You know, a mixture of mechanics makes games a lot more interesting. So just to finish up for this talk, I'm going to go through some examples of games and I'm going to break down what it is that actually makes them a challenge. So the first one's one of my favorite games, one of a lot of people's favorite games, Breath of the Wild. It's a modern Zelda game, open world RPG. Obviously, it has mechanical difficulty because there's a combat system in the game that requires, timing, precision, and reaction speed for different types of things using different weapons. It has mechanical puzzles in the game that require you to lift up objects and move them precisely. Or, for example, there's a really horrible puzzle in the game, or a shrine in the game, rather, where you have to freeze a boulder and then hit it with a hammer and try and launch it a really long way into a hole. And I just spent so long trying to do that one. So that's mechanical difficulty, right? It's about precision, timing, reaction speed. There's a lot of obscurity in the game. You have to explore the map, find secrets. There's actually very little direction. It's very much an open world game in that there's a small number of core objectives, but mostly you're just exploring and looking around and figuring things out on your own. And there's a reasonable amount of logic in the game because the core kind of dungeon replacement mechanic in this game is these things called shrines, and inside them they're generally physics-based puzzles. So you have to figure out how to solve the puzzle in order to complete the shrine. Now, if we look at a game that is not even arguably, I'd say objectively much more difficult than Breath of the Wild, Counter-Strike, right? The modern iteration is Global Offensive, and you can see there's a lot more different types of difficulty, which is interesting. It employs a lot of different challenges, and as a result, I'd argue that Counter-Strike is a very hard game when you're playing it online against other people. Of course, there's all the mechanical difficulty parts, timing, reaction speed, moving, shooting, throwing grenades. Counter-Strike has very low error tolerance, right? There's very high ratio of damage to health. You can die very easily in one single shot from someone else, right? And so if you make a mistake and you stand out in the open by accident, you can just lose the round. And it's quite punishing because you can have to wait up to 2 minutes before you can do anything again, right? Memorization is a very heavy element of Counter-Strike, knowing the maps really well, the locations of all the spots that people hide, the bomb sites, the names of areas so you can communicate with your teammates. There's a huge amount of strategy in Counter-Strike in terms of positioning and movement, guessing what your opponents are going to do. Careful use of limited resources like grenades and spending money is very important strategically in Counter-Strike. And of course, it's multiplayer, which makes it a lot harder. You have to coordinate with your teammates as well as competing against other people. Disco Elysium is one of my favorite games recently, an RPG with no combat at all. It's really incredibly well written, and the voice acting is fantastic. And this creates difficulty in some different ways to normal games, right? The entire game is based around probability, right? Every time you do any kind of conversation action. When you're talking to someone, you have to do these weighted dice rolls that depend on your abilities. And so, it's all based around probability, and it has both trivial and non-trivial probability events, checks that cannot be retried. And so that's reduced error tolerance, like the fact that you have these checks that can actually, cause you to deviate completely down a different path in the game and close off a whole section, right? It's very low error tolerance in those cases. Leans very heavily on obscurity, gives you almost no indication of what you're supposed to do. It is a detective game after all, right? So there's hidden items and areas all over the game. Memorization is a very big element of Disco Elysium because you have to remember what characters have said so that you can negotiate and accuse them of things, right? And of course, there's a very strategic element as well because there's a skill tree that you can allocate points into, and that affects your probability of being able to do certain actions, or even if your skill points are too low, it can lock you out of doing certain things completely. And it's always interesting to look at games like Animal Crossing, because if you said to someone, why is Animal Crossing hard, right? They would probably think, I don't think of Animal Crossing as a hard game, right? And it's because it doesn't use the traditional mechanical difficulty, right? Like it doesn't rely on that type of thing to create a challenge in the game, but there is significant challenge in Animal Crossing. It has big time investment, right? It's got both grinding and time gating. You need to catch fish or bugs or whatever over and over again, mine minerals. You do that by doing the same repetitive actions every day kind of thing. And there's also time gating where you upgrade your house or you build a bridge and you have to wait a whole day, to the next day. Items only refresh once a day in real time, right? There's a huge amount of obscurity in the game, very little direction on what you're supposed to do. You have to discover the game for yourself, and that's actually a challenge in some ways, right? On top of that, there's an enormous number of hidden items, fish and insects and that type of thing. And of course, there's a heavy probability element in Animal Crossing as well, because the game is full of randomization, right? Random islands that you fly to, random fish that appear in the water, random items for sale. And so you have to put in a lot of time to get those favorable probability events. Oh, and of course, I almost forgot the biggest probability event of all. There's like a stock market mechanic built into the game where you buy these turnips and you hope that at some point during the week the price of turnips will go up so you can sell them for more and you won't lose your money, right? And the last game I just want to have a look at is a city builder game that I really like called City Skylines, right? It's a kind of like SimCity. It's a city building simulation. It has a big time investment mechanic in that population growth actually takes quite a long time. Even at maximum game speed, you have to wait a long time for your population to grow, right? It has a very heavy strategic element because everything you do has long-term consequences, right? You need to think and plan your cities very carefully because you can't just kind of retcon things later. It has probability elements because things like fire do occur like randomly in the game. It actually has quite a solid system of logic, quite a challenging logic system, because there are lots of interlocking rules in the game, the way that traffic works, the way that people commute to and from work, right? And understanding those systems and thinking carefully about how to, solve traffic problems is very important to doing well in this game. And of course, it has a big learning curve because your first few cities are just going to be horrible. And the idea is just you get sick of your current city and you start again. And it's the same game. It's not like there's a new level with completely different buildings. It's the same. And you just learn to build more effectively. Your previous games don't carry through resources, for example. You can't grind in City Skylines and then get to level 60 and start a new game with 1 million resources, right? It doesn't work like that. It's all about you getting more skillful. So just in closing, I think it's interesting to think about the fact that difficulty has kind of fallen out of focus from the days of arcade games in terms of the raw number of people who are going to succeed, right? And the amount of hours of practice that you need to succeed. Games aren't as directly, literally hard as they used to be, but they tend to have a much wider mixture of different types of challenge, right? And it's also worth mentioning that games don't actually have to be hard to be good, right? There are plenty of amazing games that aren't hard at all, that you just interact with and you kind of have a wonderful time slowly going through it without it necessarily ever being an extreme challenge, right? I will say, though, as one last thing, that while there are plenty of good games that aren't challenging, it is worth mentioning that difficulty is something, challenge, right, is something that's unique to games that doesn't exist in other media, right? When you watch a movie, the movie's going to keep playing regardless of whether you understand it or not, right? And you can keep reading a novel regardless of whether you're actually getting the main point of the story or not, right? Games are pretty much the only thing that can actually physically prevent you from continuing unless you can demonstrably understand how things work or demonstrably get better at the mechanisms that the games are encouraging you to do. And so I think that challenge being a unique thing to video games is one of the reasons why it's so important as a designer to understand how it works and to be able to design, satisfying, varied, challenging experiences. Thanks. I hope you liked the talk. And as always, if you want to chat about it, I love talking about this kind of thing. So you can leave a comment or just message me directly, and I'm happy to have a yarn about the different types of difficulty in games. Thanks.